Hello, everyone, and welcome to Your Mind, Your Reality, Your Results, a weekly live show where I speak with an expert in the subject of mindset so you can change your mindset and ultimately get the amazing results that you want in your life. If we haven't met before, my name is Leah Fink, and I'm the owner and founder of All Thrive, where I help protect people from the pain of damaged relationships. If you ever want to discuss that, I would love to connect. Now, I am very pleased today to be joined by Nima. It's so great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
So grateful to be here. Thanks for having me on, Leah.
Oh, it's very much my pleasure. Now, if you're seeing this for the second time, we do apologize. There were some technical difficulties with the streaming, and so we're hoping this is working now. But apologies if this is a repeat for you. If it's not, or if it is, and you want to connect with this topic, which I recognize can be a little bit challenging, might bring up some feelings or thoughts, we would love to hear from you. So please do feel free to put those comments or questions in the box. Take advantage of Nima's expertise. Even if you're watching this show and it's no longer live, feel free to put those comments and questions in, as we can still get back to you after the fact. So just to start off, I would love for the audience to hear a little bit about you and your history and how you came to be an advocate today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally have always really had an interest in community service. Honestly, my journey, even as a visible minority myself, has kind of shaped my outlook towards the world and has honestly made me that much more determined to learn about others and expand my own perspective, and engaging in any opportunity I can to kind of celebrate differences and really promote the idea that, differences can be a source of betterment other than anything else. Ultimately, I am actually an engineer by trade, but my passion for community service has essentially led me to working for an NGO called NCCM. So that's the National Council of Canadian Muslims. And it's basically an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization that's dedicated towards protecting the human rights and civil liberties of Canadian Muslims, and by extension, really all Canadians, and promoting their public interest, building mutual understanding, and challenging Islamophobia and other forms of xenophobia across the country. And so our work for our organization primarily revolves around four primary areas. We look at civil liberties, advocacy work, media, education, and community outreach. And in terms of my role as program coordinator, I essentially get to create and lead national initiatives that are geared towards, essentially combating racism and xenophobia across the country through a means that's both community engaged and innovative in nature. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit about me there.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's such an important journey, I think, to have come from even an engineering background to be able to apply that now. And one thing I really want to highlight, which I really like that you spoke about, is that although you obviously have a specific focus against Islamophobia, that racism or inequality or discrimination across the board are all similar issues. It's not that people tend to maybe only have one thing that they're against. They tend to have different opinions that weaken our culture across the board.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's also a great intersectionality in the type of work that, we deal with, Islamophobia in general as well, just, kind of as a fact. Muslims, Canadian Muslims in particular, kind of constitute for one of the most ethnically, culturally, and racially diverse religious populations in the country. And so even a lot of the work that we do on a day-to-day basis, there's a great deal of, overlap with anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian, anti-Black sentiments as well. And one of the things that we acknowledge at NCCM is the fact that in order to combat any form of hate, we need to really work to fight against all forms of hate in this country. So, I think it's really in terms of standing with one another and making sure that we're able to create a future and a nation where everyone feels accepted and welcome for who they are.
I mean, I very much agree. It is critically important that we do that. And just as we start out here, because I know you mentioned the word hate, and a lot of people, when they think of racism, they might think of those big actions, right? That people attacking each other, physical violence. And it is much more subtle than that. It doesn't have to be those huge actions. So do you want to start maybe by talking a little bit about maybe some of the more subtle ways it could appear that people here who are wonderful people wanting to be equal might be accidentally doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the, like the ways that I personally felt racism myself, just kind of speaking to my own experience, has been through microaggressions, right? Really kind of unconscious biases that a person might have or assumptions that they might kind of make. And I think it's easy to get caught into that, especially when you don't know about something. But I think in reality, like what really can be and it does kind of start very subtly that way in terms of having a misunderstanding or a misconception about something, not being fully informed or having all the facts, and a lot of the hate that we've seen kind of stems from fear, honestly, right? And I think one of the biggest things that we need to overcome really to get over this hump of working towards being more inclusive and more accepting in general is eliminating this fear of the unknown, really embracing any opportunity of what you don't know, as a way to learn something new and to really just grow closer to people around you. I think it's really, it can start in subtle ways in terms of being able to kind of expand your mindset by meeting new people, having conversations, creating safe spaces in which you can essentially ask these questions in a way that's, more so towards the informative lens as opposed to being offensive. And I think a lot of that just kind of entails taking the first step to really, engage in as many opportunities as you can to expand your mindset and keep yourself well informed about what's going on.
Yeah. I really like what you're talking about and those microaggressions and noticing them. And this piece of fear, to me, is the first thing that we really need to look at or need to understand. And it can be daunting. And to be frank, I think that minorities have much more to fear from a system that works against them than the majority has to fear from meeting those people. But do you have any other suggestions as well to really help people get past that first hurdle? Are there specific things you do within your job that really try to help people get past that first hurdle of the unknown and reaching out to someone new?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we do at our organization is that we have an entire department that's, dedicated towards education. So we work hand in hand with multiple school boards across the country to kind of develop material to have these conversations, from the get-go in terms of how educators can have this conversation with their students, how we can also get parents involved in that conversation as well, in terms of, basically addressing some of the misconceptions that kind of exist out there and what conversations they should be having with their children as well, kind of starting in small ways there. Other things that, NCCM does is that we have various campaigns and initiatives that you can get actively involved with. So oftentimes, a lot of the work that we do also entails advocacy. So we'll have a great deal of material kind of available on our socials about some of the most pertinent issues that are going on in terms of whatever civil rights issue it may be, and active action items in terms of what you can take to start helping us. Well, whether that be, signing a petition or simply even just getting the knowledge out there about the fact that this is happening and that this is something that we need to actively address as a country.
To me, I see one of those first actions as well, which is something I did want to talk with you about today also, is being aware of our own bias. Like noticing that this is not just an external problem of those people who are taking horrible actions, but also can be, like you said, those microaggressions, those minor biases. To me, that's the starting point. And do you have any ideas about how people can start raising that awareness within themselves?
I think it comes down to being brutally honest with yourself, and in terms of not shying away from the fact that as humans we are we're not perfect, and I think there's a certain degree of practicing self-compassion within that as well, and being just brutally honest with the fact that there is always going to be something new to learn. And I think once you're embracing yourself, like you're looking at this from the lens of being able to expand your mindset as opposed to it holding you back, I think is probably the first way of overcoming that fear. I mean, I know personally, one of the ways that I even got involved with this work really was, visiting the Faith and Spirituality Center at my university, for instance, and being able to interact with people of all types of backgrounds and finding similarities. I think it's so easy to caught up in looking at, what might be different about the person that you might be speaking with or whatever culture you might be encountering. But I think it's also very important to maybe, try to find the universal aspects of what, really connects us as humans.
Yeah, we're both female. We breathe the same air. We have these shared experiences of meeting on Zoom and talking to each other. There's so many similarities. So I love that you mentioned that, because I think that's also a great way to start that connection. I'm also curious about your thoughts about potentially how Canadian culture could be hindering this a little bit. And this is just my opinion, but what I've noticed is you have some groups that are more overt potentially in their racism and a little bit more blunt, and it's easy potentially as our kind of nice society to hide a little behind it and talk about it behind our breath, or think this idea of, well, if I don't say it to someone else, or if I'm not actively hurting someone else, it's fine. What are your thoughts on that kind of backroom whisper culture about things like racism?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to have those difficult and uncomfortable conversations for that reason. I think it's something that we need to lean into a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I've encountered prejudice through a smile as well, and it could be as subtle as somebody, simply complimenting you on how well you're speaking English, or something along the lines of reiterating the question of where are you from. It's kind of being kind of brutally honest, right? Because even these big forms of hate, or these movements that we're seeing that are that are divisive in nature, really stem from these smaller conversations that began to fester. So I think it's really about being honest with yourself, and I think it's also about like kind of just re-examining where we stand, and also kind of calling people out when you see that type of behavior as well. Not only does that set a standard for yourself, but it sets a standard for others around you.
And so that was going to be my next question is, knowing that can be hard. We know that like groupthink happens, and a group of people together will have maybe similar values, that it's hard to stand up against other people and say, hey, that's not cool, stop that. Have you found any strategies, or do you recommend any strategies for people to be able to start that first hard conversation and say, like, call someone else on when they're doing this?
Well, I mean, there are ways of, I mean, it really depends on the situation at hand, but obviously kind of just being polite in terms of being able to, or redirecting the conversation in a sense that it's, more so a question about something as opposed to making a blanket statement about a group. I think is a good way to kind of start that way. Also, just kind of being open to engage in a conversation from a place of curiosity as opposed to already having an all-knowing perspective, is something that's very important from what I've encountered as well. I think that's really where it stems from, like being able to kind of do it in a way that's, it doesn't have to be abrasive, just in terms of being able to say that, hey, maybe we should look at it from a different perspective, or maybe even just presenting an alternative take, or encouraging the person that you're speaking with to maybe refer to other resources to kind of expand their own understanding about what they're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, and I'm wondering, I guess that's the next step. Would you recommend that if people are starting to notice these biases, or they're starting to notice in their conversation that someone called them out, or they called someone else out, is that the next step you'd recommend, is finding resources?
I think it's being kind of and like looking at it from the lens of being able to kind of grow together. Even when I have questions directed at me, and that's one of the things that kind of comes with being a visibly Muslim woman, is that, I mean, even when I was making the decision to wear the hijab, initially that's what my mother warned me about, was the fact that I would be, I would have to be ready to answer all sorts of uncomfortable questions. But I kind of embrace that as an opportunity to connect with people, right? And so I think it's just a matter of really seeing that as a way of not calling somebody out or blaming them for thinking the way that they do, but really kind of using this as an opportunity to extend kindness and also kind of grow together as a person, right? Like just in terms of being able to educate your fellow, whether that might be a family member or your colleague or whatever it may be, but kind of directing them to the fact that there is a different take to this, and that encouraging them in the direction of learning more and expanding their own mindset with regards to that.
Yeah. And you mentioned too earlier a little bit about obviously bringing this to schools, bring this to youth so they can grow up with a different mindset, with a different viewpoint. Do you also think there's a responsibility of adult groups, so offices, community groups, to take this on altogether versus just one person doing that learning?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, even some of the work that we're doing with our education department entails actually working, within at companies, right? Doing D&I training there, having several workshops on Islamophobia, but also talking about bystander intervention and allyship and what that really looks like in the context of being in a professional space. So there's numerous ways to kind of go into that. And I know for a fact that there are a lot of organizations that go working hand in hand with a lot of businesses to kind of see that through. I mean, it's something that really extends to all generations across the board. So it is something that, I definitely think is really important to have really at all levels.
I fully agree with you. I hope that businesses, and I think it is happening a little bit more, that they're putting in that diversity piece and hiring professionals to come in, such as yourself, to explain that. You also talked about allyship, and I think this is a really important piece that people can take on. It's not just saying I have a black friend. That's not allyship. But do you want to talk a little bit more about what it could actually look like to be an ally?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think allyship in general, I feel like is being, I mean, again, kind of echoing the sentiments of what I've been mentioning before, but, opening yourself to understanding a different perspective, being open to learning and actively learning, as well as actively listening to those that are around you, right, who have actually gone through these lived experiences, and proactively looking for ways of what you can do to support them, right, in terms of educating yourself on the issue first and firsthand is probably the biggest step to take. Obviously, you don't want to engage in a way that's, misinformed. Knowing the history behind, what has actually, why this is something that is affecting the community so much, and why it's something that, something that you should be combating as a person, and finding proper avenues to kind of express, and support what those groups are going through, whether that be through a petition or a protest, but actively engaging in ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be just performative. I think educating yourself is very much the first step, and encouraging and really elevating those that haven't had a voice, actively trying to seek ways to be the voice for the voiceless, I think is very important. And I think that's a constant process. It's not just a one-off thing that you can do, but I think it's something that we continuously have to work at as people.
I love the way you said that. And I personally believe very much that the responsibility for making these amends for the reach out should be the people in more power, right? So possibly the majority of people or whoever has that little bit more privilege. How was I going to phrase my question here? I know a lot of people might put the onus and say, well, if you feel you're being discriminated against, you should be going to HR, and as the minority, should be taking more responsibility. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about your experience of why that's challenging and why it should be a little bit more in the responsibility of those who have a bit more power?
I think in a lot of instances, when you're the one who's being discriminated against, you feel very powerless, and you don't know exactly what avenue to go through, especially when you're in a culture where something like that is accepted, or something like that is being dismissed, or simply just being tolerated because people are just complicit with letting that go on. So you honestly fear standing up and expressing what you just went through, because you don't know necessarily how it's going to be received. And I think that ties back into that piece of D&I training for people on a business level, because you need to be able to cultivate atmospheres where people who are experiencing this type of prejudice feel essentially empowered enough to come forward about it and to address it actively as an organization. I think having that culture of support is fundamental in making sure that we have a future where these things don't continue, and we are really truly able to actually put these the sentiments of diversity and inclusion and equity into actual practice, as opposed to kind of just using it as a word to kind of put on everything that's out there.
Yeah.
It's interesting, living in this pandemic, some of the conversations that it's brought to light, I think it's very encouraging. And the fact that we're moving in a direction of becoming a lot more socially conscious. And I'm glad to see that, at least empowering and uplifting the voice of those that have kind of been unseen and unheard for the longest time is really making its way into the national conversation.
It's wonderful that it's happening. And one of the things I've seen a little bit more, which I think is wonderful, is also the people in power actually asking if that's the impact that group wants, not just assuming that this is what your group would benefit the most from, but actually, and I think even on an individual level, being able to say, hey, Nima, I just learned about this. Should I be doing this? And getting that feedback right away is so critical.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of it comes down to really good communication, really active listening, in terms of being able to, really just kind of be able to practice that empathy and being the consideration of others. It really does go a long way. And I think it's going to be pivotal in terms of being able to make sure that we continue on this path of, enlightenment. There's certainly a lot of work that still needs to be done. And I think that's one of the things that people often forget. It doesn't, unfortunately, it takes, tragic events and really horrible things to happen for us to kind of come together as a community. But really, in reality, that shouldn't be the case. I think often one thing that we should embrace is the fact that, combating racism or any hate is an ongoing process. It's something that, takes a lot of self-reflection, and it's something that will continue to, evolve over time. So it's something that we should fully embrace as a journey, as opposed to just, one thing for us to do in our day.
Yeah. Well, and I would love actually for you to talk a little bit more. I know you have one event that we're going to share a link for later as well, but about some of the other pieces you do, because I do think that is really helpful for people to hear about what's actually being done, because it can be overwhelming, first of all, to think of course, there's multiple different places where there is discrimination in society. So
Mm-hmm.
who do you read about first? What event should I go to? What resources should I look for? And I would love for people to just hear a little bit more about what you've been doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, one of the coolest things or projects that I've gotten to work on, or one of the national initiatives we did recently, was actually a hackathon to end online hate. Honestly, kind of addressing a problem that has, obviously it's very relevant right now, but it has a direct correlation to some of the hate motivated violence that we've even seen in the country. And so one of the things that we did with this national initiative is that we, really encouraged Canadians, really of all walks, to kind of come together to create teams to develop a tech-based solution that addressed, essentially preventing the spread of online hate and the misinformation that also contributes to that hate. And in doing so, it was really wonderful to be able to see Canadian talent kind of putting them on a pedestal and showcasing their ability, and also being able to kind of connect them with various avenues to continue their work. So even the winners of our competition that we had in October are currently working hand in hand with entrepreneurs and CEOs, as well as tech investors, to essentially help develop their solution, making that into a reality, and really having, an actual product that people can actively use to meet the purpose of combating online hate in a proactive way. So that's one of the things that we've been kind of looking at in terms of a long-term lens, knowing that, the rhetoric in which we kind of approach these conversations is very important, and the channels through which we have that is also very important to consider when it comes to combating any sort of hate in the first place. And another thing that, NCCM is currently working on, and I'm currently overseeing, is our Green Square campaign. So January 29th is the designated day of remembrance for the Quebec Mosque city shooting back in 2017. It's also the official day to take action against Islamophobia. And January 29, 2022 is actually going to be the first inaugural observance of that day in our country. So that's the Green Square campaign is something that we have revolving around that day. It's essentially takes place in the week leading up to January 29th every year, to remember the victims and the survivors of the Quebec Mosque city attack. And essentially the campaign really entails wearing a green square that represents the carpets of the mosque where the victims last stood to pray. And it also symbolizes, that they're in a better place. And it's really just a way of showing solidarity, along with the victims' families, and really just taking a stand against Islamophobia in general. So it's a national campaign that we'll be doing. We'll have more information on our socials as well at nccm.ca/Green Square is where you can find more information about it in terms of how exactly you can get involved, and, the various things that we'll be doing that day, and, things that will be available to you to essentially take part in that initiative.
That's fantastic. And it's certainly something I'm looking into. I hope everyone here now hearing this, we're going to make sure the link is in the box. So this is something that you can participate. Maybe this is your first step to learning something new. I do want to pull us back for a sec, because you started talking about something which I also see as a really prevalent cause with your hackathon, that the online spreading of hate is a lot like maybe those backroom conversations. that people are more anonymous, they feel more safe to express these fear-based views. I know some people who do care about this will actually block people on their social media who they see posting these things. Do you think that's the most effective way to deal with that, or have you found another way that's really helpful to combat online hate, aside from obviously, the programming you guys got from the hackathon?
I mean, I think it's about bringing awareness to it as well, right? Like just in the sense that this is happening, or being able to report it in a way that makes that aligns with actually having that content taken down, being able to identify it as being problematic, and I think counter communication comes into that as well, right? Like in the sense that you can also challenge these perspectives online, and even if that's not affecting necessarily the person who is saying these things, at least even having a comment underneath that redirects them to learn a little bit more about the topic might help those that might be reading this and then have to encounter content like this over and over again just because they saw one post that related to it.
That's a great suggestion, because also for the people who might be maybe on the fence or not understanding about the issue, being able to see that other perspective, because when you block someone, they just get to sit in their own self-reinforcing group of people who might be continuing to spread that. So that is a great suggestion.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to be able to kind of, I know it's you don't want to engage to a point where obviously, you're getting kind of put into a Twitter war, but of course, but to the extent where it seems appropriate, right? I think I've seen comments under just about every single post that we've even made for our organization, various spots, countless times every single day. But I think having a counter perspective underneath, especially from an ally, helps substantially, right? I think that's another form of being able to practice allyship, is being able to kind of redirect people and help to grow their understanding on a topic that they might not know about, and that unknown quality, or basically that misinformation, is what's contributing to a hateful perspective that endangers everyone that's essentially targeted through that perspective.
Completely. And that is the power of allyship, right? Is it someone who's maybe in even a more similar group to that person who is spreading the hate, who is able to have that bit more sway, hopefully, over their words, hopefully be a bit more listened to, and then bring them into that conversation in a new way so they hear the other voice that is being suppressed or damaged or unheard in some way.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, honestly, addressing online comments in a way is a little bit easier in a sense, in terms of what kind of bringing back to that suggestion of being able to, respectfully call people out in those instances is a little bit easier in that sense. So I think it is important to have, a counter perspective there. So, people are able to kind of see it from a different lens and understand that this is necessarily not the only route to take when it comes to understanding an issue.
I know we're reaching the end of our time here, but do you have a last message for people to inspire them or to get them moving on this?
Yeah, no, I think it's really about essentially a lot of self-reflection and also being able to be brutally honest with yourself. And I think realizing the fact that growing to be a more accepting human being is a journey. It's not something that one can kind of do in one instance, but it's something that we're constantly growing at. So I think it's important to be forgiving of yourself as well, but to also use that as a form of being able to enlighten yourself and grow as a person. And I think it's also important to kind of actively find ways that you can go about and educating yourself. And one of the ways that I can think of best is obviously following NCCM on its socials. Essentially getting better versed on some of the issues that are impacting minorities across the country, some of the rights that are being infringed on, and what you can do actively as a Canadian to kind of help with the fight of making sure that we have a more inclusive future for everyone in our nation.
Yeah. Well, I certainly encourage that as well. We'll make sure those also go into the comments. And just to reiterate one more point, to be an ally or to look at this stuff can be hard. You can feel really guilty about it, and you can either stay trapped in that guilt and feel bad and not engage, or you can take that next step. You don't have to stay the same way. You can change your mind and help people moving forward. So I just want to thank you so much for being here today and having this really important discussion with us.
Yeah, no, again, thank you again for having this conversation. I really hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it as well.
Amazing. And thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you next week.